And I think, you know, it's kind of moving into the kind of question and answers and discussion phase now. You mentioned something which really ties in with what Sam said at the start, and is that we need to avoid a top-down imposition of these rights, because that can create a conflict of rights. And, you know, if you're looking at, you know, climate change policies that need to make sure that working class migrants are included in these policies and don't end up with a conflict of rights, we really need to think in this kind of cross-disciplinary way. And it can be done so wrong. I mean, if you look at the Gilets jaunes movement in France, for example, that's something that started out, the impetus behind, you know, increasing taxes on things like petrol and things was to, well, it was claimed to be anyway, you know, to improve the environment, to protect nature, to ward off climate change. But yet it was done in a way that didn't take account of the class dynamics in that, and it created a huge backlash. And that's something I think we need to be wary of going forward. And, you know, we've had a question in the question and answers box here as well from an anonymous attendee, which I think ties into this. Ultimately, capitalism and imperialism and neoliberal politics are at the root of all of these problems. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to really create a systems change. So I'd like to throw this question or reflection point open to the panel, perhaps maybe starting with Sam, if that's okay, or someone else if they want to take, that's fine as well. But kind of how do we move forward and create a systems change and have climate change policies that don't end up kind of creating a clash of rights, and, you know, things like with the Gilets jaunes movement in France. So if you maybe want to start with that.
Yeah, I don't mind starting. Thanks, Claire, and thanks to all the other panelists. I'm absolutely fascinated by all the contributions, and I just find I learn so much by being on these panels, not just as a participant, but listening to them. And I think Paul really fascinated to obviously dig down a bit into some of those thoughts about the rights of nature as well. So I think that is really important. But how do we, I mean, from a trade union perspective, for us, that's where we need to push a narrative, and it's about education, and it's about political education, and it's not just about, you know, of course, as trade unions, our fundamental role is to protect the jobs of our members, full stop. That's what we have to do. But I think for some of our trade unions, so the more progressive ones, and certainly ones like PCS, are looking at, well, yes, we need to protect pay, terms, conditions, but what does that mean in reality? And when I mentioned the Shell strike in the US in 1973, one of the strikers there said, well, what's the point of winning on pay if we're actually not going to live? You know, because obviously that was about health and safety rights, but I think we can very much use that as a parallel for climate change as well. So, which is why in the UK context, our just transition narrative is, okay, well, let's transition all these fossil fuel workers, for example, and the common thing is into renewables jobs, but it's just not a like for like green job swap, which we need. And it's great for those workers, and of course they should be protected in their families, and this is often repeated now. We've got the experience of the deindustrializations of the 80s and 90s and the devastations of that, and actually which pushed a lot of people arguably to the right wing and the populism culture, and which is why we have to address all those issues within it and have those discussions in our trade unions and build our industrial strategies. Which is why, you know, in some respects, I think looking at it from the legal perspective and starting to think about this, and when we start thinking about these notions of a climate strike, you know, we need to start looking in terms of, actually, if we don't take actions, if our governments don't take actions, if we don't challenge the corporations, if we don't challenge issues of power and ownership, and some of the issues raised here around taxation, how that's used in a very pervasive way against people, and around this sort of sense of a public good and our rights to universal services, then we're not going to make these changes. And I think we have to start having those debates, and it's a debate we've been having in the trade union movement the past couple of years, and we're part of a global initiative called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, but it's really looking at issues of power and control and how we win that back for people. And some ways we're going to have to do that, obviously, by direct action. And what I argue, we didn't win anything realistically in the trade union movement. We had some rights given us under EU law, etc. But realistically, we won our rights by being on the streets, and that's where we will probably win on this in the end. But that isn't just about trade unions being on the streets, and that's being out with lawyers, that's being out with the climate activists and everybody else, and seeing this as a common cause. And I think the things around the land issues, because quite ironically, the stuff that Paul said, if I wasn't here today, I would have been up in my local town square protesting against the local authorities' monster building plan that they've just unleashed on us, which we've got very little redress to challenge under the planning legislation, which a lot of people don't realise, and we have wonderful local campaigns. But I think people are starting to feel, well, enough is enough. A lot of that's going to take public land in a highly urbanised area with more densification, building 27,000 dwellings in the next few years, which is just incredible with the tensions that will then create within our communities. And I think one thing, obviously, the COVID crisis, which we've learned, our access to those green spaces, our access in terms of our mutual aids and solidarity have become very pronounced, and how important that is, and the gross inequalities that have been exacerbated and been very sharply brought into view, not just in the UK, globally, around these inherent inequalities. So I think there is a slight movement now. It's like we've really got to change the system, but we have to keep hold of that. These things can move and we can lose them very, very quickly. So sorry, I've gone on a bit, but I think that's where we need to start.
That's brilliant, Sam. Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that particular issue, or will we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I just want to come on to that if possible. I think that's a really good point. And one of the issues we face is this, like, between the rock and a hard place issue of climate justice and economic justice, of like saying, well, actually there are billions of people around the world who don't have a Western lifestyle and who perhaps may eventually want that. How do we deny that to them, versus how can we reduce the West's consumption without that very much screwing over the working class and leading to a Gilets jaunes style protest movement, because we're asking people to effectively reduce their living standards. Now, some of that can perhaps be dealt with by moving away from our economic system, but some of it probably can't. Even if we had a socialist system, it would be very difficult to reduce Western people's carbon emissions down to an equitable amount that would allow everyone else in the world to have the same amount. It'd be very difficult indeed. And one of the ways around that is probably to say, well, actually, maybe the Western lifestyle, even capitalism aside, maybe the Western ideal of what we think we want isn't actually it at all. And maybe we should be looking to those around the world who have been able to be sustainable for thousands of years in some cases, and also have happy, fulfilled lives, and remain within their sustainable and not at odds with nature and the earth, and trying to say maybe that's what we should be trying to emulate, because otherwise I think, say, between that rock and a hard place of trying to reduce Western carbon emissions in a way that would be equitable, I think that's going to be quite hard.
Thank you, Paul. I think that sort of answers a question we had as well from Miriam about, are there any cases similar to GLANs are being pursued by lawyers with human rights activists in the global south, or just not in Europe, in the Western world? So Michaela's cases there, the examples from Ecuador and from Bolivia are brilliant, and Colombia as well. And I think just bringing Gearóid back into the conversation, I'm just wondering about this case, Gearóid, that's been filed at the European Court of Human Rights. Obviously, a case, by the time it's filed, to the time it's actually heard by the court, decided upon, I mean, years can go by. I worked at the court and it was just after the attempted coup d'etat that weekend. So the backlog is really huge there. And obviously this is an urgent issue that we can't wait years and years heard. So, what level of redress can we expect from a court? Like your convention, something that is inherent in that legal system to allow for policy divergence among states and not to impinge on national politics as such and policy making. So with the time issue and this margin of appreciation and not wanting to encroach on states' policies and margin to make the policies they see fit, how can we really bring these issues forward on an international legal level with courts such as the European Court of Human Rights?
Yeah, on the issue of timing, we heard from the court yesterday that the case has been given priority. So that's significant. Hard to read into what what the implications of that are, but from a timing perspective, that's good. As you said, that rightly said, this is an urgency. This has an urgency that, as Phil Powlesland said, we have to recognise that the human rights system may not survive climate change. The court must grapple with, and this is the first opportunity that it's had. So hopefully that means that prioritisation leads to regarding the margin of appreciation that I would like to venture into categorically making some sort of assessment on how the margin of appreciation would interface with a case like this. Definitely leave that to our who developed this case over the last 3 years. But the margin of appreciation to determine how it can pursue its obligations with cultural, local, national interests factored in. That doesn't stop the court declaring that there has been a violation of the rights of these children by virtue of the fact that they have failed. And I think this is where one of the things which I didn't get to discuss about our case is that we're looking at the failure of states to determine what is an acceptable fair share. How is it that what burden should be taken up by a particular state? And it's the absence of that measure that has allowed states to largely decide on self-serving policies that say, okay, look, we'll reduce our carbon emissions to this much. There's no external validation of whether or not that is sufficient or not. And what we're arguing is that states ought to come up with that measure between themselves and determine what is an acceptable burden that should be taken on by a state, and that gives you a way to measure whether or not your state is living up to its obligations. Currently, you don't even get to the margin of appreciation because states defer to the executive. So we're not even at a point where litigation can unlock the problem of climate change because there's been a fudge, and states have been able to kind of say, hey, we're doing enough by our own determination, and we're hoping that our case can reverse that burden, reverse that flow.
That's really interesting, Gearóid. It reminds me of a case ongoing in the US now as well, this Juliana case, and where the court did recognise the urgency, but said, well, your redress is at the ballot box, it's not in the courts. And obviously that's something that I think all of us here disagree with, that there is a place for the law, and the courts do need to be able to step in and hold the executive accountable for an issue that is so urgent, and our survival depends on it. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that particular issue? No? Okay, let me have a quick look at what other questions have come in here. It's great to see the questions coming in. Thanks, everybody. There's one interesting one here about property and the human right to property. This is something that is in the European Convention of Human Rights. It's in most national legal systems. private ownership of property. And it's something, Gearóid, that you mentioned as well in the case filed by the 6 Portuguese young people, the right to private enjoyment of property. And this is obviously very kind of a capitalist framing of rights frameworks, and civil and political rights have always taken precedent in the international and national legal systems over economic, social, and cultural rights. So to what extent, in terms of even also the migration angle coming in here as well, and the climate justice coming together, to what extent is the predominance or important position of private property rights in human rights frameworks an impediment to the work that we're trying to do here and the kind of issues that we're trying to bring forward? And this is open to anybody who'd like to come in here. Paul, I think you're muted.
There we go. Thanks. I want to jump in there. It's slightly tangential, but it's also a way of dealing with some of the questions that have been raised in the chat in relation to what I mentioned about the need to build more homes versus impingement upon nature and what that means. And I think a few people have sort of said that it sounded like I was maybe trying to put the blame for that onto migrants. And I really wasn't trying to do that. I was saying that basically if we continue in the same vein, i.e. with land ownership and with the way that we build and have land ownership in this country, whilst continuing to accept migrants as we should, that will eventually lead to, I think, a crisis and a flashpoint between, well, do we build more homes or do we keep these trees? And we need to find a different way of doing that. And I was actually putting it out there to say, well, what are the ideas for that? Because carrying on as we are doesn't work. And I said that there are some easy wins, banning second homes, banning landlords would help, but that probably wouldn't be enough to keep going eventually. And so we need to look at different ways of the way we use land in this country. And actually one of the interesting ways would be in terms of redistribution of land. We have an incredibly unequal distribution of land in this country. It's owned by a very few, and much of it, many of us can't access that land. And so I'm involved in sort of right to roam campaigns, that everyone should have a right to be able to go out into nature and enjoy it. But more importantly, that land is often used to economically benefit a few people. And actually one solution could be that, okay, we have X amount of farmland, much of it is actually incredibly degraded, not that useful for nature at all. So we take some of that to use for housing, and then we turn some of it into wilderness. So actually, on balance, nature actually improves as a result of that. So we get houses, and also we get rewilded areas and more nature, as opposed to just vast areas of kind of sterile farmland. Could be one way of addressing it. But yeah, that was more a question for discussion rather than a kind of this is a problem that's insolvable, I think. But I was trying to put that out there.
I'm really conscious that we're running over and we could keep going, and my apologies to people who have put questions in and anyone that didn't get them answered. We could really keep doing this all day. These are really complex areas and we have so many questions, not necessarily all the answers yet, but I just want to thank the panel so much. Sam, Gearóid, Paul, Kayla, thank you so much for giving up your time on this Saturday. I've taken so many notes personally, lots to think about, and those ideas will be churning in my head, and I'm sure everyone's heads for weeks and months to come. And I think that the strength of the cross-cutting expertise that we have from you really shows that when we put our heads together and we look at these things, not just in our silos, we can come up with solutions together that are grassroots solutions, and not top down, but bottom up. I'd just like to leave you all with just, we mentioned earlier about the constitutional changes underway potentially here in the UK and changes to judicial review. And there is a committee looking at this at the moment, and there is a call for evidence for people to make submissions and to partake in that, and the Haldane Society is doing that. We're working on a submission at the moment, and we're going to be looking at bringing in things like, rights of nature and standing, and being able to challenge executive actions over climate change and nature rights and migration together into this. So those ideas will be feeding into that, and keep an eye out and people to be aware that that call for evidence is out there to contribute to that. So with that, we'll pass over to the next brilliant panel that's ready to go. And again, thank you all so much.